All right, we are continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew here on the Listener's Commentary, and in this session we're going to be looking at Matthew 27, verses 33 through 66. And we're right in the middle of this gripping narrative as Matthew tells it about Jesus' arrest, being condemned to die, and then his crucifixion. And so in our last recording, we ended with Jesus being officially condemned to die by the chief priests and the scribes, handed over to the Roman governor Pilate, who they needed to be on board with that if they were going to execute him. They finally persuaded Pilate to crucify Jesus, and so Jesus has been flogged, and he's on the way out of the city in the last scene to the place of execution. And so we pick up right there in Matthew 27, verse 33, where it says, "And when they came to a place called Golgotha," which means place of a skull. And so they've arrived out of the city at the place where he's going to be crucified. And frankly, we don't know the exact location, and we don't know why it was called the place of the skull. The traditional locations in Jerusalem, if you go visit today, you can go to Gordon's Calvary, which is a very traditional location, but it's only been a traditional location for a couple hundred years. Then there's a more ancient location in Jerusalem inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that may preserve the actual spot. We just don't know. The main thing is they've arrived here at the place where Jesus is going to be crucified. They tried to give him some wine mixed with bile to drink, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink it. Jesus didn't want that stuff. And so verse 35 says, "And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots." And the brevity of this always strikes me. When they had crucified him, with that passing statement, the whole event of hanging Jesus on the cross is summarized and left for us as the readers to infer. But in the ancient world, no more needed to be said. The original readers knew. They could see it. They could hear it. They could hear all the sounds associated with it. Why? Because the Roman practice was to crucify people at the most public, visible place they could, so that it would warn all the populace of don't cross our authorities. But for us, we don't really know. We can't totally visualize it. We can't totally hear it. We don't have sort of that visceral response to this phrase, when they crucified him. And typically the way it went was the victim was stripped naked to add to the shame and the humiliation. And so here the Roman soldiers are playing games to see who gets what of his clothes. And then they would nail his feet and his hands to the cross, and they would drop him in the ground. And for hours, in agony, he would labor to get a breath as he slowly suffocated to death. That's the way crucifixion went. And so here's Jesus suffering in agony and dying, and they're playing games for his clothes, which again speaks of how trivial and how callous humans can be to each other. And we should note here the connection with Psalm 22, which Jesus will actually quote very shortly. Matthew doesn't make an explicit connection to Psalm 22 like John does in his account. John actually even gives more details as to why. He tells us that this playing of games was how they were going to decide who got his tunic, because they didn't want to rip it up. But even though Matthew doesn't explicitly connect it here to Psalm 22, Psalm 22 is obviously on his mind, because as Matthew tells the story, he includes several phrases and details that derive from Psalm 22. So here, with casting lots for their clothing, that comes from Psalm 22. Matthew reports all those who see him mock him and shake their heads. That's Psalm 22:7. He says he trusts in God will let him rescue him. That's Psalm 22:8. And then climactically, we have Jesus quoting Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so as Matthew has told his account, he expects us to see Psalm 22 in the background behind all of what happens to Jesus here. And so here Jesus is hanging on the cross, and they're casting lots throwing basically like dice to decide who gets his tunic. And then verse 36 says, "And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there, and above his head they put up the charge against him, which read, 'This is Jesus, the King of the Jews.'" Notice again the official charge. From the trial right through to this point, the focus of this whole thing has been Jesus' kingship. So that the record of history shows that's what got Jesus killed. He was killed for being the King of the Jews. And so here now is the placard above his head while he hangs on the cross. It is like a royal placard, Jesus, the King of the Jews, posted as the criminal charge for his execution. And at that time, 2 rebels were being crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. So Jesus is in the middle, and you have 2 more people who were executed that morning. So Jesus isn't the only one to die that day. Luke actually includes a few more details about these 2, but Matthew simply mentions them here. And then verse 39, "And those passing by were speaking abusively to him, shaking their heads and saying, 'You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross.'" And again, this mocking and this ridicule from all sides just contributes to the shame and the degradation of the cross. That's why the Romans would do it in such a public place, usually at major crossroads or a major intersection, so many people could see it. And so now they're all mocking Jesus and saying, "You said you could tear down the temple. Well, look at, you can't even save yourself. Save yourself and come down from the cross." And in the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and the elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself." But that's the whole irony. And really, it's the whole point. In order to save others, Jesus can't save himself. And that's why he's hanging on the cross. And Matthew knows that. And so in telling the story this way, he's highlighted that for us, that indeed, if he wants to save others, he cannot save himself. Now their mocking continues in the rest of verse 42 and on into verse 43. "He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we will believe in him. He trusted in God. Let God rescue him now if he takes pleasure in him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" And all of this is, notice, mocking his identity as King of Israel, Son of God. If God really were on his side, God would do something about this. But again, that's the irony, and that's the point, that Jesus is actually carrying out God's will by hanging on the cross. Verse 44 adds that the rebels who had been crucified with him were also insulting him the same way. So the bypassers on the road, the chief priests and the elders, and those who were crucified with him. Now, Luke highlights that one of the 2 actually changed his heart, changed his mind, decided not to mock him, but actually asked for mercy. But the point here in Matthew is that everybody is mocking Jesus in this moment. And so here, as Messiah and King, he is experiencing the shame and the degradation and the humiliation of the cross, being mocked by the very people he came to rescue and save. Then Matthew tells us in verse 45 that from the 6th hour, darkness fell on all the land until about the 9th hour. Mark notes for us that Jesus was originally hung on the cross at the 3rd hour. So by the time we get to this moment in verse 45, Jesus has been there already 3 hours. So the 3rd hour is about 9 in the morning. The 6th hour here in verse 45 is about noon. And then the 9th hour is about 3 p.m. And so Jesus was on the cross for about 6 hours from 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. And then verse 46 says that about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And this is the opening line of Psalm 22. And Jesus speaks it in Aramaic, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which is Jesus' native language. And Matthew preserves that here for us, but then translates it for us so we know what Jesus said. And Psalm 22 is a psalm written by David, and it's about a sufferer, a righteous sufferer. Well, Jesus is the ultimate righteous sufferer. He is the Son of David, who is the most righteous of all, now suffering here on the cross. And the fact that he quotes it here at this climactic moment suggests that Jesus has actually been maybe meditating on Psalm 22 while he's on the cross. And so now, as he recognizes the end is near, he cries out this opening line from Psalm 22, really, and it's a cry for vindication. I have done what's right. I don't deserve this. God, where are you in the midst of this? And yet, just as the sufferer in Psalm 22 trusts God all the way to the end and trusts God to vindicate him, so too does Jesus. And that's really the point of this cry here. Well, when those who were standing by heard this is how they responded. Look at verse 47. Some of those standing there, when they heard it, said, "This man's calling for Elijah." So they assume he's calling maybe for the prophet Elijah to come and help him. And immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine, put it on a reed, and handed it up to Jesus to give him a drink. But the rest of them said, "Well, let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And Jesus cried out with a loud voice, and gave up his spirit. And with that, the King of the Jews has died. Now, Matthew continues, and he notes two very interesting little details that, from his perspective, are very significant for the meaning of Jesus' death. So look at verse 51. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The veil in the temple most likely refers to the veil between the holy place and the most holy place. The most holy place was the place that the high priest went into on the Day of Atonement just once a year, took blood in there, and went through the Day of Atonement ceremony. And according to one rabbinic writing, that veil was a handbreadth thick. That is about 6 to 8 inches thick, and it was about 60 feet high and 30 feet wide. So a massive fabric veil. And symbolically, being torn in half like this symbolizes that the ultimate and final atonement had been made once and for all, just as the book of Hebrews explicates for us, right? Like Hebrews gives much detail how this death of Jesus and the tearing of the veil opened the way into the presence of God. And that's why Matthew, in telling this in his narrative, that's why he tells it, because he sees the significance of this moment. With the veil being torn, the way into God's presence is now open. Ultimate redemption, ultimate atonement has been made once for all. Then we get a little section, another little detail that Matthew throws in that seems to have something to do with the significance of Jesus' death, and yet it's really kind of odd. It's only in Matthew. Here's what it says. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split. Also, the tombs were opened. And many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, that is, died, were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered into the holy city and appeared to many. That's weird, right? It's a little bit odd. But it's a sign of the significance of Jesus' death. And the way Matthew records it, he does so in such a way that his original audience, Jews who knew the scriptures, they would catch. So Matthew's telling his story, remember, to a Jewish audience. They would recognize, if they paid attention, some echoes and allusions of an important little moment in the book of Ezekiel. Notice the two little phrases there in what Matthew says where the tombs were opened and coming out of the tombs. Well, that alludes to Ezekiel 37, verses 12 and 13. Ezekiel 37 is the famous Valley of Dry Bones vision, which pictures Israel coming back to life after God ends their exile. Well, verses 12 and 13 explains with the very language that Matthew uses here. It says this, "This is what the Lord God says, Behold, I am going to open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves." Now, that language from Ezekiel 12 and 13 is very much the same as what Matthew says here, opening up the tombs, coming up out of the tombs. That's what Ezekiel is talking about. This little episode here is also confusing because it sounds like the tombs were open, but they didn't come out until after Jesus' resurrection. Scholars have wrestled with this, and most conclude that what Matthew means is, because of this earthquake at Jesus' death, some of the tombs broke open, but the people didn't actually rise until after Jesus' resurrection, when now the exile's over and new life is given to Israel, as Ezekiel 37 says. Now, verse 54 continues the narrative and says, as for the centurion who was standing there, the centurion is the Roman captain, right, who's standing there, and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the other things that were happening, they became extremely frightened and said, truly, this was the Son of God. When it says Son of God, recall how Matthew has highlighted this title at key points in his story about Jesus. He highlighted it at Jesus' baptism, way back at the beginning of his gospel. Then he highlighted it again at the transfiguration, where the voice from heaven says, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. He highlighted it at Peter's confession in chapter 16. And now here, in this climactic moment upon his death, this truly is the Son of God. And so, dying on the cross does not negate being the Son of God. It actually demonstrates it. It even demonstrates it to a Roman centurion and other soldiers standing there. Indeed, Jesus, in his death, is the Son of God. Matthew continues the story and says, and many women who were there watching from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee while caring for him. And among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee, which all reminds us that there are more people involved in the ministry of Jesus than those who get most of the screen time, and that many of those who were involved were actually women. 3 get mentioned by name here: Mary Magdalene, another Mary, and James and John's mom. Mark also mentions a 4th woman that was there, a woman named Salome. John notes that Jesus' mom was there too, and his mom's sister. So there's a number of people around this cross at this moment, and many of them are loving, loyal, faithful women. Now, Matthew wraps up the narrative of Jesus' death this way. Jesus died. It's about 3 in the afternoon. The Sabbath begins in just a few hours at 6, and based on Deuteronomy 21, Jesus needs to be buried before then. Deuteronomy 21 says that if a person committed a sin carrying a sentence of death and he's put to death and you hang him on a tree, his body should not be left overnight. So they need to get it down in the next couple hours. So here's what happens according to Matthew, verse 57. Now, when it was evening, so we're late afternoon, a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph came, who himself had been a disciple of Jesus. So here we meet Joseph of Arimathea. He is a covert follower of Jesus, and Mark tells us that he's a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. So he's a man of high standing, and therefore he has the status to get Pilate to release the body of Jesus. So verse 58, this man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, a burial cloth, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut out of rock, and he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. And so here, very briefly, Matthew summarizes the burial of Jesus. Pilate releases the body of Jesus to Joseph. Joseph, probably with some friends, gets Jesus taken down from the cross, wraps him in a burial shroud. Joseph has his own tomb, which is not too far away. It's never been used. Notice it's a new tomb. It's a cave tomb, very common in the area, lays Jesus in it. It puts a large stone over the entrance, and that's that. And because it's already late in the day, it was sort of a hasty burial. They didn't have time to go through all the normal processes for a proper burial, but they got him down and they got him buried before sundown. And, verse 61, Mary Magdalene was there and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. And so they're watching this whole process. And Luke tells us that after this moment of watching Jesus be buried, they actually went back to where they were staying. They prepared some spices and perfumes so that when the Sabbath was over, they could return to the tomb and finish the burial process. And that's where we end this particular scene. All right, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by your generous support. So thanks a ton for your generosity. And if you want to join the team of supporters, easiest way to do it is to swing over to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and you can put in a one-time donation right there, or you can click a little box that says Make This Monthly, and you can set up a monthly recurring donation right there. Thanks a ton for your support.